As I speak with you, there is a woman in Texas who is awaiting the state's decision on her fate while sitting alone in a 6x9-foot cage. Only the faint sound of the air conditioner and the infrequent footfall of guards break the silence tonight within the red brick walls of the Odaniel unit in Gatesville. On her cramped cot within this maximum security prison, Taylor Rene Parker has gazed at the same concrete ceiling for the past 2 years, night after night. Professionals in the field of prison psychology have identified several stages that death row convicts go through, and those who have studied Parker have described a woman who is torn between rejecting and glumly embracing. When she speaks with members of the legal team, she sometimes insists that she is innocent. Sometimes it feels like a crushing blanket is settling down on her shoulders from everything that she has done and will do. What, however, actually transpires in the last 24 hours preceding execution? Even fewer have watched beyond the reporters, have never grasped the complexities involved in a state's decision to terminate a life. When the time comes, I will describe in detail what Taylor Parker's final day on Earth will be like, and I will do it tonight. In case you haven't been following along, Taylor Parker is the woman from Texas who viciously assassinated her pregnant friend Regan Simmons Hancock in October 2020. Attempting desperately to keep up the illusion that she was pregnant herself by removing the baby from her womb. It only took the jury an hour to find her guilty of capital murder. If we want to know Taylor Parker's current situation, we have to take a quick look back at the horror she made. A young woman called Regan Simmons Hancock was viciously attacked in her house on October 9, 2020 in the calm hamlet of New Boston, Texas. Regan, who was eagerly anticipating the birth of her kid, was 34 weeks along in her pregnancy. However, earlier that day, a person she showed up at her door armed with a hammer and a scalpel, seemingly out of the blue. The brutality of the assault was incomprehensible. The intensity of the blows delivered to Regan's head on multiple occasions caused her skull to crush into her brain. To her surprise, though, she was still breathing when her assailant started slashing her belly from hip to hip. The crotch, Regan battled valiantly to protect the life of her unborn daughter as well as her own. In the midst of her terror, she had no doubt that her 3-year-old was somewhere in the house. Regan resisted the extraction of her unborn child until she just couldn't do it any longer. It is not merely the ferocity of the crime but also the careful preparation that makes this case so disturbing. Taylor Parker had been deceiving herself for a considerable amount of time prior to the murder. In order to make her partner believe she was carrying his child, she had gone to extreme measures. With convincing detail, she acted out ultrasounds. She threw a lavish gender reveal party, and everyone there rejoiced over an unrealized pregnancy. In the process of gaining Regan's trust and friendship, Parker had photographed her engagement and wedding. Behind the scenes, he was also plotting a hideous object. Parker had looked up information on how to care for babies born prematurely at 35 weeks on the morning of the murder, according to investigators. A hammer and a scalpel were among the instruments she brought to Regan's house, hand-picked for the task at hand. No emotion or suddenness was involved in this crime. Rage. With chilling exactness, every detail has been computed, investigated, and organized. What she was about to do to her friend was crystal clear to Parker. Just 21 years old, Regan Simmons Hancock was a newlywed who was overjoyed to be welcoming her new baby into the world. Baby girl into the world. One of the few individuals who truly cared about her, Parker had her engagement and wedding photos photographed by her. The last moments of Regan's life would be witnessed by her 3-year-old daughter, who was already a mother to Regan. Baby, the unborn child, Braxton Sage Hancock, was separated from her mother at 34 weeks of gestation. She was viable and battling for her life. According to medical experts, baby Braxland had a beating heart at birth, but his death was hastened due to Parker's brutality and lack of care. At last, when Parker's case reached when she stood trial in September 2022, the prosecution presented indisputable proof. A total of 142 witnesses testified throughout the course of the 3 weeks, providing a comprehensive picture of her aggression and deceit. A jury of 6 male and 6 female jurors found her guilty of capital murder on October 3, 2022, following only 1 hour of deliberation. Her destiny was to be determined by the identical jury that had found her guilty. Taylor Parker was sentenced to death on November 9, 2022, following a little over an hour of deliberation. Those were the terrifying last remarks of Judge John Tidwell. Put her on death row. Here's something about death row that most people don't know. It is possible that Taylor Parker will never be executed. The numbers are shocking and unsettling. Texas has carried out 595 executions since it restored capital punishment in 1976. However, approximately 600 of those put to death, just 6 have been female. And that's in a state where the death penalty is still in use, just 1% of all executions. The story is told via the names. 1998, Carla Fee A. Tucker. 2000, Betty Lou Beats. 2005, Frances Newton. 2013, Kimberly McCarthy. 2014, Suzanne Basso. And 2015, Lisa Coleman. More than a decade following Coleman's death sentence long time ago, Texas did not execute a female. Death sentence cases in Texas can wind their way through an intricate and lengthy appeals process, which can last decades. The Texas Court of Criminal Appeals is currently hearing Parker's initial round of automatic direct appeal. This is solely concerned with mistakes that she made throughout her trial. She has the option to ask the U.S. Supreme Court to review her case if this one is unsuccessful. State habeas corpus proceedings follow, during which she may bring up further grounds for challenge, such as incompetent legal representation or prosecutorial wrongdoing. Federal habeas corpus proceedings commence in the United States once state remedies have been exhausted. Appeals process beginning in the district court and ending at the Supreme Court. On death row, time passes at a snail's pace. On death row, a convict typically spends more than 11 years before execution, according to data from the Texas Department of Criminal Justice. But you can't trust that figure. People who have already been executed serve as models for it. Reality takes a lot more time for people who are still waiting. Texas death row convicts have, on average, waited 18 years for their verdict. Several of them have spent more than 3 several decades. Before his execution in 2023, the longest-serving death row convict in Texas spent 32 years behind bars. With 29 years under her belt, Parker has plenty of time to live into her 50s before she faces execution, should the day come. Parker may be able to escape certain death due to legal loopholes. Through the automatic appeals procedure, her defense attorney intends to contest the conviction on many grounds. Jury selection processes, prosecution behavior during trial, or the revelation of graphic crime scene images are all potential issues that could lead to a return of the verdict. Moreover, Parker's recorded issues with if her lawyers did not conduct sufficient research into or offer mental health defenses, her health problems, particularly what she referred to as unresolved trauma, might form the basis for claims of ineffective assistance of counsel. She may also face consequences if the Supreme Court's stance on capital punishment and mental illness were to change. Travels from court to court. Have you any opinions? Is it necessary to shorten the appeals process? Please inform me in the space provided. However, Parker encounters a distinct type of punishment as she makes her way through this intricate court system. The psychological anguish to wait. The clock strikes 6 in the morning every day. After more than 2 years of staring at the same concrete ceiling, Taylor Parker finally gets some sleep. With a metal bed, toilet, and a space that's less than most bathrooms, her cell is about 60 square feet, basin, and compact desk for note-taking. The institutional iciness of a place, meant to shelter the condemned, is all that the red brick walls of the Odaniel unit in Gatesville have to offer in terms of comfort. A gap in Parker's cell door allows for the delivery of breakfast every morning. In contrast to the condemned men who endure lockdowns by eating cold sack lunches, Odaniel's female employees provide marginally superior service during meals. She may be able to have some leisure time after breakfast if the staffing situation permits. A 50 by 10 yard area furnished with a bench, 1 tree, and basketball hoops makes up the recreation yard. There she spends around an hour, on her own, doing things like shooting baskets or walking in circles. Outside her cell door is a television, but she has no say over what shows air there. Guards make the programming decisions. Odaniel unit is profoundly isolated, but in a unique way. contrary to the expectations of many. The women in Odaniel receive somewhat more merciful treatment than the males at Polinsky, which is supposedly the worst death sentence in the nation. Regardless, Parker is confined to her cage for a minimum of 22 hours every day. This kind of seclusion has terrible psychological effects. Anxiety, despair, hallucinations, and paranoia are common outcomes of prolonged solitary confinement, according to prison psychologists. Inmates who start having internal monologues often start to detach from the outside world. All the time they're screaming, the prison commotion adds emotional and mental strain. Though not as terrible as that of the prisoners on death row, Parker does have very limited opportunities to interact with other humans. Under the watchful eye of the guards, she is permitted 4 5-minute phone conversations annually. Her rights to visits are only approved family members and attorneys may participate in the glass petition process. The male residents of the Polinsky unit are required to live in total seclusion, whereas the female residents of Odaniel are allowed to work 4-hour shifts and are subject to strict television viewing restrictions in a communal room. Their programming must be in sync, and they must occasionally friction. Parker is able to receive mail, although it is subject to security screening. She can attend religious services, and there is a small library, albeit the selection is limited. Conditions for males on death row are very different from Parker's. The guys at Polinsky unit face what many perceive to be the toughest conditions on death row in America, while she lives at Odaniel unit and has relative privilege, if that's even a word. Inmates spend 23 hours a day cooped up in tiny cells measuring 6 by 9 feet, with no access to work opportunities, social interaction with other prisoners, or outdoor space to enjoy themselves. Avian excrement. In their cells, they consume cold food alone. At the same time, Parker is able to work 4-hour shifts, participate in supervised activities with other women, and eat hot meals. The disparity is a reflection of how society treats condemned men and women differently. The fact that Parker is physically confined isn't the cruelest part of his life. Feelings of not knowing are excruciating. The prospect that her appeals may be unsuccessful, that a date for her execution would be set, or that she will remain in this limbo for decades more is something that she faces every day. According to those who study life on death row, convicts experience what is essentially a perpetual state of fear and heightened awareness. Her pleas may give Parker hope on occasion. On other days she is hit by the harsh truth of her predicament. There is no certainty regarding the time, whether she endures a distinct kind of mental anguish that intensifies every day, regardless of how many months, years or decades she has left. Similar to Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's 5 stages of grieving, prison psychologists have identified various stages that death row convicts go through. Denial is the first step. Detainees deny responsibility for the guilt or the success of their appeals. Anger, directed towards the system, their lawyers, or perhaps society at large, follows. The next step is to negotiate a sentence reduction through pleading with God, making vows of rehabilitation, or negotiating with legal counsel. As a result, depression knowing that one's own mortality is imminent brings a crushing sense of realism. At last, some people are able to accept their fate without fighting it. In contrast to those with terminal illnesses, however, death row inmates endure an additional torment. No one can predict the exact hour of their demise. Unlike other death row convicts, Parker has a unique psychological journey. The vast majority of convicted felons continue to deny guilt for many years despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. However, the evidence was found on Parker, who was captured with the stolen infant. With her, it becomes psychologically difficult to maintain innocence when the deceit is so elaborate and documented. She felt more remorse than usual because her offense included betraying a buddy who really cared about her. Instead of acting impulsively or killing random people, Parker meticulously planned her turning traitor. Her psychological development may be accelerated by her analytical disposition. Treatment for mental health issues on death row presents difficult ethical challenges due to the fact that self-deception becomes more difficult to maintain with the weight of premeditation.
Psychologists are required to handle convicts with the knowledge that their actions could potentially return someone to a state where they are competent to be executed. Although Parker has access to mental health care, the seeming contradiction persists. If her mental health improves, she may be able to die more easily. Would you ever find yourself in this kind of predicament? Post your opinions down here. The victims are not limited to Parker though. Beyond the confines of the prison, this suffering continues. Reagan's loved ones also suffer from mental anguish, enduring the anguish of constant appeals in the absence of justice not completed. Research shows that family of death row inmates frequently go through skewed patterns of grieving that last decades as the legal process drags on. Here is a detailed account of the last hours that will transpire once Taylor Parker's appeals have been exhausted. Texas is in the Farker sexus de Cutui, the scuduous persicages ivor. At 6 o'clock a.m. Parker's last breakfast on execution day will be the usual jail fare, not a special meal. By 8 o'clock a.m., all of her last-minute appeals will be rejected, she will be informed. At 10 o'clock a.m., the last stage of processing visitors starts. The deadline for submitting clemency petitions to the governor is noon. By at 2 in the afternoon, we have finalized the witness lists. At 4:00 p.m., last-minute phone calls are permitted. The deadline is 5:30 in the afternoon. She'll be led on a stroll to the prison cell. At exactly 6 o'clock p.m., Texas starts its last process. Parker will be moved from the Mountain View facility in Gatesville to the Huntsville unit, which is home to Texas's execution chamber. A few hours before he is to be executed. Exactly when, where, and how transportation is classified for concerns of national security. Her medical records and execution packet will be transported in a designated vehicle. She will be led to the holding room, which is only 30 feet away from the execution chamber, the moment she lands at Huntsville. She will be subjected to a strip search, fingerprinting, and the provision of clean TDCJ garments. The transfer signifies the last permanent stage. There is usually no turning back for a convict once they reach Huntsville on the day of execution. Parker will be granted one last visit from authorized family members and spiritual advisors in the hours leading up to his execution. These visits take place in a tiny room close to the execution chamber, behind reinforced glass dividers. For her last calls home, she will have access to a phone conversations that are listened to but not recorded. The Lone Star State permits convicted convicts are allowed to visit with loved ones up to around 2 hours prior to their execution. Everybody concerned is emotionally devastated by the visits. Surreal as it may seem, many family members find themselves trying to say goodbye to a loved one who will be dead in a matter of hours. Not all prisoners want visitors, some would rather die alone, instead than going through the anguish of saying farewell. Even more ironically, Parker will not have the option to select his final supper. Following death row inmate Lawrence Brewer's request for a lavish feast in September 2011, the practice was outlawed in Texas. 2 fried steaks of chicken and 3 slices of bacon devoured a cheeseburger, fried okra, pound of barbecue, 3 fajitas, pint of ice cream, and peanut butter fudge, all without touching a bite. The 87-year tradition was abruptly put to an end by State Senator John Whitmire, who deemed the practice highly improper. Now the same food that was given in the death chamber to Texans on death row was people in the community that day. Whatever is on the standard prison menu will be Parker's last meal. Parker will have the opportunity to speak with a prison chaplain who can offer her spiritual guidance and emotional support as she approaches her last day behind bars. The priest usually has a meeting with the condemned the day prior to their execution. Purpose of introducing himself and outlining the procedure. He comes back to console and advise on the day of execution. If Parker would like religious advice, he will also assist her in making phone calls and relaying messages to family. Accompanying her to the death chamber, the chaplain follows the customary was there for her in her last moments, a reassuring presence. However, owing to decisions made by the Supreme Court regarding religious freedom in 2019, chaplains are no longer permitted inside the chamber during the actual execution. Just hours before she is to be executed, Parker will have the chance to rehearse her last statement, the very words that will define her: express yourself. In the days or weeks leading up to execution, prison officials usually have this conversation with condemned prisoners. She has the option to prepare a statement that the chaplain can read out, speak on the spot, or stay silent. Witnesses from the media will record her statements, which will then become part of the forever archive. Inmates often take this opportunity to express their remorse, assert innocence, or bid farewell to loved ones while serving their sentences. Some express furious rejection, forgiveness, and serenity come to others. Among the last things Reagan's family hears regarding their daughter's killer are Parker's last comments. At 6 p.m. Shiv. Next, Parker will be escorted by prison authorities to the execution room from the holding cell. A brief stroll that symbolizes the last leg of her life's journey. After being granted permission to shower, she will be dressed in clean TDCJ attire. Prior to now, a tiny antiseptic room with a cushioned table at its center is the Huntsville execution chamber. Parker will be restrained with her arms out on supports, her face facing the table. Unexpectedly, it's a really systematic and fast process. Over 500 times this procedure has been carried out by prison officials. They have complete timing and task accuracy down pat. After securing Parker to the table, the coroners led the witnesses into 2 observation rooms, one for the families of the victims and another for her family. 15 witnesses and members of the press can be accommodated in each chamber. While IVs are implanted into both of Parker's arms, his family from Reagan will be able to see him through a thick glass window. In 2012, pentobarbital, a single medication that supplanted Texas's 3-drug cocktail, was remotely injected by an executioner in another room in response to the warden's signal. Although Parker will die a few moments after losing consciousness, around 10 seconds, short period of time. At about 6:20 p.m. a doctor will declare her dead. About 20 minutes pass between entering the chamber and death. We can learn a lot about how to spot harmful deceit from Taylor Parker's situation. Parker exhibited classic red flags that his loved ones either failed to notice or chose to ignore. She fabricated increasingly complex stories because she lied compulsively. She was endearing on the outside, but her extravagant accomplishments and staged tragedies failed to convey her actual character. She has trouble maintaining relationships due to her chronic dishonesty. The most important thing is that she did a lot of research for her lie, making up ultrasounds and posting phony pregnancy updates on social media. The extreme measures taken by an individual to conceal information, typically involving when faced with a significant life event, such as a pregnancy, loved ones should step in and have tough conversations. During the trial, Parker's defense attorney brought forward an important argument. Her loved ones let her down by not questioning her about the false pregnancy. It was emphasized by mental health experts that when someone starts making up stories about important parts of their lives, someone needs to step in and help. Parker's actions betrayed his mental health issues. He lied compulsively, needed approval desperately, and refused to confront reality. Averting this tragedy could have been possible with early intervention in mental health. Instead of remaining silent when someone is being dishonest, we should educate ourselves to detect when their deceit has reached a pathological and potentially harmful level. Sometimes it's necessary to face painful realities about loved ones in order to save lives. The example of Parker shows how desperate measures can lead to unfathomable acts. Brutality when a person becomes entangled in their own deceit. A ticking clock was set by her fake pregnancy. She was under great pressure to have a child by a certain date. Worry began to creep in as her due date drew near. Instead of admitting to telling her boyfriend the truth, she decided to kill him. As their lies get closer to being exposed, individuals caught in complex deceit may become more dangerous. Some people may go to terrible lengths to protect their falsehoods when they feel their relationships or identity are at stake. Maintain the illusion they've created. Violence is never justified, even in cases of extreme desperation. The good news is that we can learn to spot red flags by studying this trend. Our society's lack of adequate assistance for individuals dealing with infertility and miscarriage is exemplified by Parker's case. With her having a hysterectomy at the young age of 23 was really distressing. However, she was left to cope with this tragedy on her own rather than receiving proper mental health help. Extreme sadness, an identity crisis, and frantic actions are all symptoms of infertility. We need to put in place more robust resources to help those dealing with reproductive rights difficulties, therapy, support groups, and open dialogue regarding choices other than biological motherhood. People are more likely to make risky choices when they associate having children with their whole sense of value. If only someone had stepped in sooner and offered sympathetic support, this tragedy may not have happened. The instance of Parker demonstrates, above all else, what communities should do when they see suspicious lying behavior. Even her loved ones could tell something was wrong with her. Polite silence was preferred over confronting their suspicions that her pregnancy was false. In order to change someone's behavior, we must be brave enough to ask them tough questions. Starts to worry, regardless of the potential consequences on relationships. The goal of community intervention should not be to pass judgment or level accusations, but rather to facilitate open dialogue about problematic behaviors. Not enabling someone's harmful delusions, even when it's difficult, is sometimes the most compassionate thing we can do. Dispute makes one feel uneasy or ungainly. Taylor Parker is still in that 6x9 cell as we wrap up today's narrative, and Reagan's family is still on the road to recovery. We are confronted with challenging concerns regarding mercy versus justice by her case. Parker made a decision, a horrific act of violence that shocked and horrified the entire town. Family, culture, and mental health systems all let her down. Is her mental condition an explanation for what she did? Does the death penalty still apply to her? Alternatively, would a life sentence be just as effective? As a culture, we need to talk about these tough topics about punishment, even though there are no simple answers. Many families were deeply affected by this event. Reagan was a lively young woman, and her loved ones lost her, who was filled with joy at the prospect of motherhood, and a helpless infant who had no opportunity in life. Court testimony and media attention have brought back unpleasant memories of their traumatic experiences which they have endured for years. Yet Parker's loved ones also endure hardship. They've been endured the ordeal of seeing their daughter condemned to death and must confront the dread of her actions. Her two innocent children now have to deal with the emotional weight of having a mother on execution row. A single execution might cause anguish for many generations to come. In 2025, Parker is still incarcerated at the Mountain View facility on death row, having spent more than 2 years. At the age of 32, she is only starting the automatic appeals process, which could take decades. Parker reportedly has taken full responsibility for her actions and has stated to the public that she has no wish to be released from prison since she feels she does not deserve it after taking something that she cannot return. The case is moving slowly through the Texas courts, but her appeals counsel is still challenging her conviction and death sentence. How do you feel about capital punishment? Will the punishment handed down to Taylor Parker stand? Join our crew and we'll carry on with this vital discussion. Please allow me to pause before we conclude in order to pay tribute to the actual victims of this tragedy. Reagan Simmons Hancock wasn't merely a nameless, faceless victim. At the age of 21, she had finally found love, was starting a family, and couldn't wait to meet her daughter. Beyond the grave, she had 3 children, a 3-year-old who saw her die, a future spouse who had it snatched from her, and a photographer who had graciously assisted with Parker's wedding pictures. Tragically, Braxlyn Sage Hancock was unable to experience the sensation of her first breath outside of her mother's womb. A warm hug from a parent. Their legacy ought to endure beyond the renown of their murderer. Theirs are the lives lost in this disaster that must be remembered.